All right, greetings. Welcome back to Sex, Race, and Class. My name is Dr. Jonathan Grant, your instructor for this semester, and I am going right into this chapter on social class, chapter 9, that you should have read for this week. And go ahead and open up your your PowerPoints. And if you see the first slide, it should say quiz one. Quiz one will be over chapter 9. So you're going to have a quiz available. That quiz will be available on Monday, and it will cover information from this lecture and the reading chapter 9 in your textbook. And it will be made up of 5 to 10 questions that will be related to this lecture, related to this information. And you will have from Monday to the following Sunday at 11:59 p.m. to open and complete the quiz. So once you open the quiz, you will have 30 minutes to complete it. Once you open it, you have 30 minutes to complete it, and you have a week to open it. Um, After that, no submissions after the deadline will be graded. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I am available to you. So just wanted to make sure that that is understood as you're looking at your assignments and you're looking throughout this lecture. All right, let's go right into the first topic. Um, as we're talking about chapter 9, the first thing I think that is important for us to discuss is this notion of socialization. So when we think about socialization, socialization is the process through which we learn what it means to be a part of any type of social construction. So if you've taken any sociology courses or if you know anything about the socialization process, we know that so many things are socially constructed. How we understand race in the world is socially constructed. And that means, and we've talked about this before, that means that the way in which we understand a person's race is based on what society tells us about race. And how we understand that is based off of laws and policies and media, culture, religion, education, schools, how these things influence our thinking. And that changes over time, right? That can go from in the 1800s, our way of thinking about race would have been one way. In the 1900s, it's another way. In the 2000s, it's a different way. It's the same way with gender. Gender is the same way, right? What it means to be a woman or a man changes over time. It changes with the century, it changes with the decades, it changes with the time. Um, and that same thing exists with social class, right? Social class and how we understand people who are of a certain class group, that can change over time, and that can also change depending on where you live. So if you live in certain countries, let's say you live in a caste system. A caste system will look at class in a very definitive way. If you're born of a certain class, then you remain in that class for the rest of your life, and that class is called a caste, right? But if you live in what is considered to be a class system, you can change your class depending on how hard you work, or what you have access to, or what you're able to accomplish. That can be argued, but that's not what this lecture is about. So class is also socially constructed depending on where you live, what time period you live in. And so that's what we mean when we say socialization is the process and through which we learn what it means to be a part of a social construction. So, socialization is how we understand these things, how we understand race, how we understand gender, how we understand class, how we understand sex, how we understand religion, right? And socializing agents are those institutions or those mediums through which we begin to understand these things. So, schools, for example, is a socializing agent. We understand gender, we understand sex, we understand race, we understand intelligence, we understand the world through school. right? Schools teach us these things. It's probably one of the first and more significant socializing agents. Um, then you have families, right? A lot of what we know about ourselves and what we know about the world, we know from our mothers, our fathers, or different people who have raised us, right? Our guardians. So that also helps us understand the world around us. So this is another socializing agent. The media is probably one of the biggest socializing agents, especially when you get to a certain age, because things like social media or TV or film, radio, various mediums send information to us, and we can either accept that information or reject that information. We can challenge it or we can receive it. And so these are the agents that are used to then socialize us, right? And basically, what they do is in some way, shape, or form, they teach us what it means to be a part of that group, right? So, for example, if you grew up in a traditional household, then a traditional household or a traditional family socializing agent would socialize you if you are a boy or identify as a boy, to then say, well, you are supposed to wear pants and you are supposed to like blue and you are supposed to play with blocks. And if you're a girl, you are supposed to wear pink and you are supposed to wear skirts and you are supposed to like dolls. That is the socialization that occurs, right? Sometimes when it comes to social class, which is what we're going to talk about today, socializing agents from the media, or socializing agent like the media would say, to socialize you when it comes to class would say, well, people who are rich or people who go to this school, people who can afford to go to private school, or people who can afford to go to Harvard, or people who can afford to go to certain schools and get into those schools are the people that are more likely to be the leaders. These are the people are the next leaders of our world. If you go to Harvard, if you go to Yale, and especially if you have the money to do those things, then you have the access to a certain type of education and culture that's needed to be a leader within this world. If a person is poor, there may be messages sent from socializing agents like the media or other places that say, well, if the person is poor, if the person does not have a lot of money, maybe it's because they didn't work hard, or maybe it's because they're lazy, or they didn't take advantage of the opportunities that exist in what is considered to be a free world. And so these are the ways in which we are socialized to think about certain groups. And that's what we mean when we say socialization. Okay. Um, and so when we talk about socialization, it's very important for us to discuss specifically a sociologist, theoretician by the name of Pierre Bourdieu, right? Pierre Bourdieu is very significant when we talk about socialization and when we talk about class, especially as it pertains to capital and particularly forms of capital, right? So talking about capital and forms of capital is important because it is Pierre Bourdieu that begin to provide us with the nuances for us to understand the way in which capital works in our society. And typically, when we think about capital, we think about money, we think about resources, we think about assets. That's oftentimes the things we think about when we think about capital. However, Pierre Bourdieu allows us to think about capital in terms of culture, capital in terms of connections and resources, capital in terms of networks, right? Which is something that was new up until that time. And so if we look at this first bullet, um, it looks at, again, capital in this more traditional way, right? So capital is looked at as this type of economic gain. And economics just simply means money, right? So being able to control the economics of a country, being able to control the economics within one's micro society as well as the macro society. And that is important because that is aligned with um, how much resources you have, typically based on your status. So if you are a person of high status, if you have a good job, if you come from an educated family, if you come from a well-resourced family, then you're higher on the class status, which means you have more control of economics, both in your micro world as well as in your macro world, especially when we talk about wealth accumulation. Then the more money you have, the more rights you have to property, which means the more rights you have to your own property, but then you can also own property outside of yourself, property that you may not live on. You can own other people's property, and then you can also dictate the rights and the rules and the regulations around with the property around you, the property that you own, and essentially property where other people have to live. And so, to some degree, you own their rights as well, essentially, right? So you get to determine property rights, you get to determine taxes, you have much more, essentially, what we call in sociology hegemonic power because of your ability to own property. So because you have the ability to own property, you have more say in the world. And essentially, depending on whether it's a communist society or a capitalist society, you can also have more influence over the politics, right? Over the politics of a place if you own the property. And so property rights, which is largely which is largely influenced by money, which is largely influenced by economics, is typically what we think about when we think about capital. However, Pierre Bourdieu says, well, there are other forms of capital that we still have not discussed. And so, from his research and from his conceptual analysis, he looked at property in other ways. One way is what he called this embodied state, right? Which we'll talk about the cultural capital in a second, the embodied state, the objectified state, and the institutionalized state. But even before that, I want to talk a little bit about social capital because social capital can be just as important as economic capital, sometimes even more important, right? Social connections, for example. If you have social capital, that can be as important as economic capital. And we're going to talk about how all of this can even go into those things, is because social capital is social connections, who you know, who you are connected to, who knows you, and even more importantly, who likes you, who likes what you do, who likes the things that you are about, who likes your interests. How do those things connect? How can you help them and how can they help you? Is there a mutual convergence, right? And so social capital is about, or capital can also be broken down into a social type of idea, social connections, because who you know can be converted into economic capital, right? And we've all heard this saying before, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know, right? So you may not know everything, but if you are fraternity brothers with a certain person who owns a business, a corporation, or who has a high position at a Fortune 500 company, and maybe they may see your resume and y'all may have graduated from the same school. You may have a little bit of experience, but because he knows you and maybe you're part of the same fraternity, he knows that you have the same principles that he has, and he will feel comfortable working with you. That might help you get a job that you've been wanting. That might help you get your dream job because it's not about what you knew, but about who you knew, or better yet, who knows you, right? So that is one connection, right? There may be in the same situation a young lady who is looking for an internship opportunity, right? And let's say young lady's mother has a friend that she went to school with, and the mother says, "Hey, my daughter is looking for an internship, and I know that you work at this place. Can you put in a good word for her?" The mother's friend may say, "Absolutely." Weeks later, that young girl in college now has an internship that could now lead to a full-time position once she graduates from college. So social connections is also capital, right? They may not be money at the time, and sometimes it is in the example that I just gave you with the young man. But even with the young lady who now has an internship that if she does well could lead to a full-time position, That is capital, right? And so Pierre Bourdieu breaks this down as one who studies sociology to say capital isn't just about the actual funds or property rights or economics right now. It's also what can lead to economic capital and eventually nobility in the future, because you have the social capital that can lead to the economic capital later, and that economic capital can then lead to you and your family and setting you up for a noble future. From that money now that you have accumulated, you can use that money to now influence power. And the more you all work together, the more, if you are a person of a certain class status marries another person of a certain class status and you put that together, now you're working on creating a family of nobility, whether you're talking about in the past or even in the present day. We may not call it nobility, we may call it something else, but this is just the framing that Bourdieu is using at this time in which he's writing. So I think that is an important concept, right? Also, when we're talking about social capital, we have to consider social closure and network structure as well. Because when we think about social capital, it's not just about who, what you know and who you know, but who knows you, but also how some of those networks can be closed off to other people. Some of those networks can be closed off to other groups. And so capital is not just about money, it's also about other social identities, such as sex, such as gender, such as race, right? Such as class. All of these things also influence social connections. And oftentimes, what you find is people who have been shut off from certain networks because of gender or because of race, they then begin to form their own social networks within their groups so that they can have those connections that can then lead to economic capital. However, what ends up happening oftentimes is when those people form groups, what ends up happening? They then start to create what? Social closures to other groups. And then those groups have to create their own path to mobility or path to nobility or path to networks. And so there has to be a network structure created, and the goal is for there to not have to be that, but to live in a country or to live in a society where people don't have to create these networks, but that we live in a free and just world where everybody can work hard and become successful. Um, so again, that is the social capital there. And then you also have cultural capital. Now, cultural capital is very important because cultural capital is based on, again, many different things. Um, very a little different from social capital, and then social is about your networks and about who you are connected to, the societies in which you're connected to. But it's specifically uh, about relationships. Cultural capital is almost about how you build these relationships and through what means. Through what means you build these relationships and what you embody in order to build these relationships, to have these people like you or want you around so that then you can become successful. And so again, going to um, cultural, one of the things that we talk about again, a lot of this really does come back to economic capital, but economic capital can lead to educational qualifications, right? So the more money you have, the more or the higher the likelihood that you are able to afford to go to college or afford to go to a private school or afford specific type of education. And then that then can give you the skills, the talents, the education, the culture, which we'll talk about in a second, the culture that is then needed to then seek more to have a job, an occupation, employment, or a business that then reinforces or perpetuates that same class status that you have, if not take you to a higher class status, right? So it's educational, the economic capital gives you the educational qualifications. Then what you learn from the educational qualifications, you take and then you make the same amount of money that you made before or more money. right? So that's what we see when we see cultural capital in terms of the culture of education. But there's something that we learn inside the culture of education that Pierre Bourdieu breaks down, right? When we talk about the embodied state, the objectified state, and the institutionalized state. And again, a lot of these are things that you learn in formal education, but also in informal education, which is very important. So the embodied state is converted into an integral part of who a person is. So, for example, when we start talking about the like cultural capital, one of the things that people look at is accents, right? Accents, taste in music, taste in art, taste in dress. All of these things are part of culture, right? How a person looks, what a person listens to, right? Um, uh, the type of music that a person listens to, the type of art that a person may like, if they can even converse about art, all of these things signify to other people what your class status might be, right? Because some of these things, some of these genres of music or art signify to the world or symbolize to the world a certain class or caste status. Well, what's say class? A certain class status, right? And so these things can be acquired unconsciously, right? Sometimes these are things that we're actually sat down and we're taught, and then other times it'll be just things that we know. So, for example, if you've ever watched if you've ever watched a movie, a documentary, and you see somebody who is seen to be of high status or influential, who has a lot of money, who has a lot of books around them, they may be sitting down and just kind of painting a picture for you here, sitting down at their desk, smoking a cigar, with books around them. They look very influential. What kind of music is oftentimes played in the background? Oftentimes, the music that's played in the background is classical music, right? Classic may be Beethoven, it may be Mozart, it may be Vivaldi, right? So you have classical music that's played in the background. And that classical music culturally symbolizes high class or high status, intellectualism, right? Culture. And so, if you are a person who knows classical music, if you are a person who's familiar with classical music, and to say, um, I know this sonnet, right? Or I know this symphony, or I know this opus, that can then tell somebody, oh, this person is cultured, this person is aware, this person is intelligent. And that could then lead to a social connection, right? And so it is these taking the time to kind of learn cultural capital is one key to success. Um, there's a story about Ben Carson. Ben Carson, for those who may not know who Ben Carson is, he was the first African American doctor, and he was the first doctor to and surgeon to separate a pair of twins that were conjoined at the head. This was, I think, in the late 1980s. It was said that this could not be done, that the twins were going to lose their lives, and he successfully um, separated the twins that were conjoined at the head at birth. And so he was very famous for this. He's a very famous surgeon, and he grew up in poor working class in Detroit, Michigan, in the 1950s and 60s. And but his mother, when he was younger, would not let him listen to a lot of the music that was very popular among him and his friends. She made him and she made his brother listen to classical music, right? They didn't know why, they didn't really like the classical music, but she made them listen to the music. And that would be the music that they could listen to while they studied and things like that. Well, there's a whole story that he has. And by the time he gets to medical school, he's applying for medical school. He has some interviews, and he has an interview at Johns Hopkins University. And when he walks in to the interview, he's talking to the guy that's interviewing him for med school. And while they're talking, he hears the guy playing some classical music on the radio. And he says, "Oh, I know that sonnet. That is blah, 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 blah." And the guy is shocked because he didn't know that a young kid, and maybe even a young black kid, would know that music just by listening to it. And so it causes him to perk up and says, "Oh, you're familiar with that?" And he says, "Yes, I've listened to classical music for a long time." And they begin to talk about different forms of classical music. And because he could intelligently talk about this level of culture, right? Culture that is seen to be of high status. This um, impressed the guy that was interviewing him, and he eventually got into Johns Hopkins Medical School, and that helped his career. I say all that to say that's an example of cultural capital because uh, Ben Carson was somebody who was familiar with something that at that time society says was of high culture and also meant of high intellect. If he knew Elvis, if he knew the Beatles, if he knew the Rolling Stones, if he knew rock and roll or Motown or whatever other musical taste that did not seem to be of high status or high culture, who's to say that the outcome may have been the same? We don't know, right? But cultural capital is so important. Being able to speak the language or know the material of people who are seen as influential or high status or highly intellectual is very important. And this is what Pierre Bourdieu talks about when he talks about the embodied state. And so, and again, this is not just about music, but also accents. Sometimes if a person has an accent or a person, particularly a certain type of accent, let's say a British accent or a French accent, and that type of culture is seen as a culture of high intellect. The French being a culture of high culture when it comes to food, when it comes to fashion, British when it comes to intellect, where you have your Oxford, where you have your Oxford University, where you have your University of London, where you have Cambridge University. And so that is seen to be a place of high intellect. Um, and so if you have an accent, that can also be a certain level of cultural capital that a person may use to leverage their ability to enter into certain spaces. So accents, taste in music, taste in art, or the way you dress, if you wear a shirt and tie as opposed to jeans and a t-shirt, that could symbol or that can send a signal to somebody about who you are, and that can then lead to could lead to social networks, social connections, which can lead to economic capital. So that cultural part of what cultural capital is that notion of the embodied state. And then you have the objectified state. So the objectified state, part of that is the cultural capital that is objectified in material objects, in media, so writings, paintings, monuments, instruments. If you were to have a collection of paintings, for example, in your room, that could be transmitted as well as be seen as part of economic capital, if not better, because of the capital transfer that it disguises, right? So if you are a person who owns a lot of books, right, that those are the material symbols of intellect, right? Those are material symbols of intellect. That is part of cultural capital. If you've read a certain amount of books, if you like a certain type of literature, if you can speak to a certain type of literature, right? Not just fiction or not just fantasy, but if you know the classics, right? If you've read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, right? If you've read what The Art of War, if you read Confucius's Letters, if you've read The Prison Letters by Antonio Gramsci, um, if you've read War and Peace by Tolstoy, just different books that are seen as important to high class, high status, and the intellectuals that can be seen as the objectified state, having objects that can then symbolize the cultural capital that can put you in the social networks that can then lead to economic growth or economic capital. So writings, paintings, right? Somebody goes into your house or to your dorm or to your apartment and they see a certain type of painting by a very influential person, right? If they see a Basquiat, right, in your home, those types of paintings, those objects, again, talking about the objectified state of cultural capital, those things can then lead to or can speak to a person's culture or the cultural capital that can help put you in the networks to be successful. If you play a certain type of instrument, if you play an instrument at all, that lets somebody know that you are part of the arts. If you play the piano, right? If you play the violin, those things are that can send a certain message to certain people, right? And so cultural goods can be appropriated both materially, but it also presupposes a certain economic capital, right? It presupposes that you are a part of a certain class group, even if you're not. So if you do play the piano, if you do play the violin, which those lessons can be expensive, a person may say, hey, this person may come from a certain class status because they have the ability to play piano, or they have the ability they have the ability to play the violin. And so this is part of the objectified state, the objects and the materials and the goods that are then used to help send a message that you could be a part of a class status that could then help people want to know more about you, or even invite you into their social network. And then the last of the cultural capital, the last state under the cultural capital is the institutionalized state. And the institutionalized state is when we connect institutions to capital, right? So it means masking inequality through education, suggesting that, well, if you get a college degree, then those college degrees can be the great neutralizer. It can be the great equalizer in society. If everybody has access to college and everybody can work hard to achieve their goals and get a college degree, then those college degrees can give everybody the equal playing field to then become successful. Those who work hard, those who put in the work, those who put in the efforts, those will be the people who will rise to the top. And so institutions and academic qualifications make it possible to then become qualification holders within society, and then you can then exchange them, right? So it puts these ideas or these conversion rates between cultural capital, economic capital, and then academic capital, right? So academic capital becomes a part of this this entire formula of what it means to be successful, what it means to be what it means to be influential, right? It's not just about the culture you have or who knows you. It's not just about the type of music you know or the type of art you know. It's also about where you go to school, how those institutions can be commodified, how institutions and schools that you are connected to and degrees that you are connected to, how do those things then later begin to translate into economic capital, right? So those are the three states that are very important for you to know when talking about when we talk about different forms of capital, right? So you have your economic capital, you have your social capital, but then you also have your cultural capital. And under your cultural capital, you have the embodied state, you have the objectified state, and you have the institutionalized state. Now, all of these capitals are valued for their ability to be converted into other forms, specifically all being converted back to economics. If you notice, that was the main conversion that we ended with. You either start with the economic capital, or you have the social capital that leads to economic capital, or you have the cultural capital that puts you in the right social networks that can then lead to economic capital. And oppression oftentimes can take place in the symbolic arena, in the symbolic violence, right? Oppression can oftentimes take place when certain symbols are not viewed as highly as other symbols. Certain cultural norms are not seen as intelligent or as high class or as high status as other cultural norms, right? And so, let's say you have somebody who has a British accent, and then you have somebody who has a Vietnamese accent. Oppression, inequality comes where then our culture says, well, because this person has this type of accent, we think that they will be more intelligent than of the British accent than this person with the Vietnamese accent or the Haitian accent or even the French accent, right? What do these cultural capitals, what do these symbols mean? And when we attach meaning of hierarchy to these symbols, that can then dictate who we allow into networks and ultimately who gets access to the economic capital. Maybe this corporation wants to hire this person who has a British accent because there's this idea that British culture is of a higher class than Vietnamese culture, even though the person from the Vietnamese culture or the Vietnamese accent may be higher, better qualified, right? Again, that can be with language, whether English is your first language or English is your second language, and what that means in terms of intelligence. And so these are the things that are very important when we talk about capital and ultimately when we talk about social class. Now let's go to the next slide. The next slide talks about class socialization. And class socialization is again how we are socialized to think about how economics leads to what class status we're in. So I want you to think of your average day in middle school. Okay. Let's say that the afternoon bell has rung and it's time for you to go home. What does the rest of your day look like? And I want you to think about your own personal life. What does the rest of your day look like? All right. You can pause this video to kind of do some reflection and then we'll talk about it. So maybe the rest of your day looked like this. Maybe after school, you got on the bus and then um, you sat next to your friends and talked and laughed, and then when it was time, you got off the bus and you uh, walked home from the bus stop, and maybe you put your clothes down. I mean, put your bag down, your lunchbox down, and then maybe you got a snack out the kitchen, and then maybe you went outside to play, right? Or maybe you did your homework first, and then you went outside to play. And then before your mom or your dad or whoever is taking care of you comes home, you went inside and you started doing your homework. And you did your homework, and then after that, you took a bath, and then after that, you ate dinner, and then you went to bed. Okay? That could have been your day. Or maybe after school, the bell rings, and the rest of your day looks like you go to aftercare. Maybe your school had aftercare. Maybe you didn't. Maybe your school, maybe you were in robotics class, or maybe you went to sports. Maybe you had sports, right? So you went to basketball practice, or football practice, or soccer practice, right? Maybe you were in ballet. Maybe you did dance for school, right? So maybe you had all of these other things that you were part of that then also influenced the rest of your day, right? It influenced what you did after that. And after you went to chess club or soccer club or football or basketball practice or gymnastics practice, dance rehearsal, then your parents picked you up from school or wherever you were. Then you went home and you ate and you did your homework and then you took a bath and went to bed. Annette Lareau, sociologist and an educational um, theoretician, um, an education scholar, did a study and wrote a book called Unequal Childhoods. And what she did was she showed how class is connected to the way in which children are reared. And what she found in her research, in her interview of many different families across social class groups, what she found was that class dictated how these kids were raised, essentially. And what she ended up finding was that there were two different ways in which families raise their kids along these class lines. Middle class families tended to have their kids in formal activities, piano, gymnastics, soccer, right? Going back to the cultural capital, these are the things that they knew would give their children the cultural norms, the cultural habits that they could then use to convert into economic capital. Having my kids take piano lessons, having my kids take violin lessons, having them in gymnastics. Gymnastics teaches you um, um, proper stance, how to stand with your back straight, making sure that you pay attention to detail whenever you're doing your flips, all of these different things, repetition, doing something over and over and over and over and over again, and training your body to do certain things, that those it gives you the skills and the capital, cultural capital, to then be able to transfer into these other skills as well. Again, piano, same thing, learning certain music, certain types of music, all of these different activities were, and even soccer, team building skills, all very important, right? Learning about teams, learning who's the leader, learning who's the backup, learning all of these different things, right? These activities, again, help their middle class students or children to be able to learn from these concerted, cultivating activities. You also had sophisticated use of language. So, middle class families tend to talk to their children more than the working class families that she interviewed. And so they talked through their problems, they talked through their issues, they taught them to defend themselves using language. They used more vocabulary, they used more language, they did more talking. And these were the things that the families did. And this was how they raised their children. And this then, in turn, taught them to use their language and critically think. They also tried to guide authority. So instead of just accepting what authority figures say, they challenged authority. They challenged the things that authority figures would say, and not in a disrespectful way, but to say, hey, can we talk about this or why this is happening? Or can we discuss things in this way? Or do you have this to say? And so there were these ways in which middle class families would inform or socialize their children, and these socializing skills would prepare them for life at a higher status level. Not life as a worker, but life as a boss, or life as an influential person, or life as somebody with a certain level of power or with a certain level of confidence. Working class families tended to um, they tended to raise their kids when it came to natural growth. Natural growth was the first example I gave, where working class families, they fit under this natural growth umbrella, and they had more looser schedules. So after school, they would typically get on the bus, they would hang out with their friends, hang out with their cousins or siblings, hang out with their childhood friends, and they would learn some of the same skills that the kids did that the kids did in the middle class families. But these skills that they learned, they would learn from the natural in their natural habitat, playing in the streets or playing at the playground. And that's where they learn to defend themselves. And that's where they learn to speak up for themselves. And that's where they learn to deal with problems. And that's where they learned certain skills or certain activities, but they learned it in a more natural setting, not in a cultivated setting of some type of organized structure. Um, there was less talk and fewer negotiations when it came to talking with parents. So parents were very forthright. This is what I said. This is what I mean. There's no negotiation. They also trust authority more. So if the teacher said you did this wrong, then you need to do it right. We're going to trust the teacher. We're going to trust authority. And so there was not much room for the kids or the children to have a say. That was more natural growth, and that was something that they saw, or that Annette LaRose saw in more of the working class families. And so that type of class socialization is very important because it shows how class literally is socialized through the family, through different types of families based on their economic level, right? So very interesting book, and if you want to read more of that, I would highly suggest, if you're very interested in this topic, checking out Annette LaRose, Unequal Childhood. Um, and so now we go to the next slide where we talk about habitus. And habitus is an important word for you to know. Habitus is the physical embodiment of cultural capital to the deeply ingrained habits, skills, and dispositions that we possess due to our life experiences and enduring system of disposition that guides thought and action. And so when we talk about habitus, habitus is one of Bourdieu's most influential, and I would say probably one of his more ambiguous type of concepts, because it refers to the physical embodiment of cultural capital. And it talks about how the physical embodiment of this capital creates these deeply ingrained habits and skills that we use in our daily life. So, for example, Bourdieu uses sports, for instance, right? He uses sports as a metaphor. And so when talking about habitus, it's like a feel for the game, right? Like if you play baseball, or if you play basketball, or if you play soccer, certain aspects of the game you can't really explain. Once you play it enough and you play it so many times, you just know what to do in a certain situation. If a fastball is coming straight towards you, you don't have to think about when you're going to hit the ball or when you're going to swing. You just know. It's just ingrained in you, right? Um, if you play any other type of sport, you know when something is going to happen, and you know what to do when it happens, and you don't have to think about it. If you play basketball, or you play football or soccer, and you run a play, and you ran that play over and over again, it becomes like what we call second nature. It's the same way if you grew up in a tough neighborhood. If you grew up in a tough neighborhood, then you'll likely have what people call street smarts. And that means when things are happening around you, you don't have to think, or you don't have to, it's ingrained in you to know what to do in a specific situation, right? If you take self-defense. And if you take self-defense and you have been in enough fights or enough hand-to-hand combat, then you know exactly what to do if you think somebody is throwing a punch, or if somebody throws a punch in a certain way. You don't have time to think about how you're going to move and how you're going to counter that punch. You just automatically do it because it's something that is natural. And so that's what Bourdieu means when he talks about habitus, right? Literally the physical embodiment of certain habits or skills that we possess because of our life experiences. Um, so one question I have for you is, have you ever naturally gotten yourself out of a situation or conflict based on innate skills that you may have, right? And I just gave you an example of that, right? With getting into a fight. And you automatically know what to do when you're in that fight because you have those skills. And so maybe that happened with you before, where you were in a situation and you knew exactly what to do to get out of that situation because you had that habitus. That's what habitus is. And that's what Bordeaux talks about when he talks about habitus. Pierre Bourdieu also makes this main argument that individuals' social position is not the result of personal attributes such as effort or intelligence, but instead he argues that individuals in privileged social locations are advantaged in ways that are not a result of intrinsic merit of their cultural experiences. And so oftentimes people who are of advantage, they are not necessarily advantaged because they are inherently better than someone else. Oftentimes they are advantage because of the not because of the personal efforts, but because of where they were raised, or what they were taught, or who they were connected to. And that's where Bourdieu slides in that sociology and the things that we have talked about and will continue to talk about in this class. So that is Bourdieu's main argument in this scenario. Um, let's go to the next slide, which then leads us to talk about social mobility. So social mobility is changing social classes in one's lifetime. So as a person begins to understand this cultural capital, social capital, all these things that we're talking about, this habitus, all of these things, as they begin to discuss and learn these things, then they can use these things to convert into economic capital that could then take them from poor to working class, from working class to middle class, from middle class to upper middle class, from upper middle class to upper class, etc. Right? And that is what we call social mobility when you're able to go from one class to another. Okay. So, what I would like for you to do is for your assignment for this week, you are going to participate in a discussion board. And so that discussion board is going to require you to watch a YouTube link, right? And so if you go to this next slide, you see that it says discussion board. You're going to watch this YouTube video. And then I want you to go a little bit closer to see how these people were able to pull off this, essentially this assignment. These people who crashed a White House party. And so you're going to find this in your discussion board. And then I want you to read this article from the Washington Post. And then based on this video and this article, I want you to tell me, how were these people able to pull off this crash? And I want you to be able to point to evidence in the article when you discuss it. I also want you to look at, how does their ability to crash relate to cultural, social, or economic capital? Because you're going to see some connections, and I want you to be able to talk about this. How does this explain the power of these capitals? And do you think these type of assumptions are dangerous to society? Why or why not? And I want you to talk about what we've talked about in the reading, in the lecture, what you've heard in this lecture, what you've read in your PowerPoint. I want you to be able to make those connections with what you're seeing in this video and with this article, okay? Also, please be sure to read the discussion board instructions, what you need to do, create a discussion board, and all of the instructions on the discussion board. And then also make sure that you respond to another student's discussion board, because that is what's going to give you your full points. If you don't do that, you're not going to get your full points. So make sure that you do that, okay? And also make sure that you are putting in the theories, the concepts, the ideas, the examples that you've heard in this lecture and that you've seen in this PowerPoint in your responses, okay? So please be sure to do that. Make sure that you go to the discussion board. Make sure you see the deadline, right? And you know when the deadlines are based on your syllabus, based on what we've talked about in the beginning of class, but you also see the deadlines on your Canvas as well. So please be sure that you are submitting your assignments beforehand. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email or via message, and I will be sure to get back with you. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed this information and the reading, and I will see you soon.